The initial 7 days arrive without any prior caution. This absence of warning does not stem from malice or memory lapse, but rather because the community perceives nothing unusual enough to warrant a heads up. For me, entering into an Amish marriage meant undergoing a profound relocation during that opening week. It was far more than a simple shift between residences, or moving from the table of my upbringing to the one owned by my spouse. My true transition was mutating from a youth who still possessed inquiries into a wife whose quietness served a specific function. Furthermore, this entire handover took place without a single verbalized regulation or explicit discussion. Instead, it manifested silently through a domestic workspace that had been fully arranged prior to my arrival, a dining routine established before I ever crossed the threshold, and a mattress I was required to occupy alongside a male whose anatomy remained a complete mystery to me. For a solid week, I opened my eyes before dawn, gradually realizing without a word being muttered that my entire existence had been repurposed. This reallocation of my life was treated as something completely mundane, a natural progression so deeply embedded in our historical customs that absolutely no one, neither my own maternal figure nor his, nor the church leader who conducted our ceremony, considered that my consent was necessary. Even now, the scent of that room lingers in my memory, a mixture of seasoned metal, burning lumber, and an unfamiliar sugary aroma preserved in glassware. Suspended over the stove, the timepiece marked the seconds with a resonance far deeper than any pendulum in my childhood home. Every moment in that space was already dictated by an alien cadence, and there I stood at 19, clad in garments of my own stitching, searching blindly for the baking ingredients. These words are not meant to serve as a grievance, but rather as an architectural schematic. I am detailing the inner workings of an apparatus that has functioned seamlessly across centuries, operating with such profound subtlety that those caught within its mechanisms never perceive the movement of its parts. For anyone who has ever gazed at an isolated society and questioned the reality that unfolds once the celebration concludes, after the hundreds of attendees depart, the lights are extinguished, the entryways shut, and a young woman transforms into a spouse within unfamiliar walls. This account serves as a solemn record. If these truths resonate with you, consider anchoring yourself to this collective history, not for the sake of metrics, but to add your presence to a growing cloud of witnesses validating that this experience is entirely authentic. If you are experiencing a sudden tightness in your chest while absorbing this in the silence of the night, linger a moment longer, for the core of the narrative is still ahead. Comprehending the events of that opening week requires a look at the preceding chapters. The period of romantic pursuit must be examined, as it is during this phase that the cultural machinery exercises its highest precision. Within our society, romantic pairings were forged under a veil of total secrecy, a foundational rule that every youth discovered early on. It was an affair of hushed voices and nighttime encounters, where a young man would arrive at the residence only after the heads of the household had retired for the evening. Companionship was shared in the parlor or out on the veranda depending on the season, yet the parameters of conversation were strictly and overtly bounded. Dialogue centered exclusively on congregational matters, kinship, and the shared anticipation of a traditional lifestyle, which was, naturally, the sole template either individual had ever observed. No words were ever exchanged regarding the physical realities of matrimonial intimacy, nor did either person map out the daily logistics. There was a complete absence of dialogue concerning dominance, submission, dietary choices, bedtimes, or whether a woman possessed the autonomy to see her own maternal family on a random weekday. This phase offered affection and the validating sensation of preference, but it withheld any true insight. I failed to recognize at the time that offering emotional comfort while withholding structural reality is the ancient mechanism by which conformity is secured. Our correspondence provided the greatest solace. His precise script stretched across ruled sheets, which I tucked beneath my bedding as though they were sacred relics. His text assured me of my virtue, my potential as a life partner, and his vision for our collective future involving an agricultural homestead, offspring, and peaceful twilight hours. My trust in his words was absolute, not out of any deception on his part, but because he was equally convinced of that reality. The identical paradigm had been presented to both of us, leaving us completely oblivious to the gaps in the portrait. The illustration highlighted the homestead, the cultivated acreage, and infants resting in their small beds, Yet it omitted the pre-dawn reality of a cold workspace at 4:30. It failed to depict the atmospheric quietude that would settle heavily over the sleeping quarters, or the internal shift a woman undergoes when her identity is overwritten. Rather than a fabrication, the depiction was merely a structural blueprint, and blueprints never convey the visceral experience of inhabiting the actual space. Following historical precedent, our marriage ceremony took place in late autumn once the crops were gathered. Hundreds of community members assembled for an extensive liturgy that stretched on for hours. As we rested on unyielding timber pews, the presiding leader lectured on obligation, compliance, and the sacred pact binding a woman to her spouse, a bond explicitly compared to the union between the congregation and the divine. The physical sensation of that rigid seat against my limbs remains vivid, as does the heavy fabric of my fresh attire, which I had selected in a shade of blue, finding a fleeting sense of autonomy in that minor decision. The aromas from the external preparation pavilion drifted inward, signaling poultry prepared for a massive crowd and massive vats of potatoes far beyond my strength to move. I recall telling myself that this moment represented the pinnacle of my existence, yet exhaustion consumed me so thoroughly by the conclusion that my eyelids sagged as we were directed to the chambers designated for our wedding night. Anticipation of the immediate future was entirely absent from my thoughts, simply because no one had ever trained me to contemplate it. The maternal figures on both sides maintained absolute secrecy regarding the matter, and the religious authority devoted hours to wifely obligations without ever touching upon the reality of a closed door, extinguished lanterns, and unprecedented isolation with a member of the opposite sex. With hindsight, I recognize that the omission of any dialogue concerning marital intimacy was entirely intentional. The framework requires a young woman to enter that space devoid of terminology, because vocabulary grants her the power to articulate her internal state, allowing her to express unreadiness, dissent, or the desire to pause. Conversely, an individual deprived of descriptive terms, who has never received an explanation of physical intimacy or been validated in her personal autonomy, is left with no option but immobility. Within that cultural framework, absolute passivity is interpreted as agreement, yielding, and the perfect emulation of historical wifely conduct. The institutional structure never genuinely requires an active affirmation. It merely demands an absence of protest. For nearly 2 decades, that exact quietude was the very attribute I had been conditioned to exhibit. It is crucial to describe the matriarch I observed throughout those initial days, my spouse's mother, who had navigated matrimony for over 3 decades. Her movements through the household workspace resembled a river flowing through a deeply eroded canyon, entirely devoid of pause, deliberation, or apparent exertion. Her day began long before the rest of the house stirred, ignited the hearth prior to the first glimmer of dawn, brewed the morning beverage, sliced the loaves, and fully arranged the dining area so that it resembled a completed thought by the time her spouse descended the steps, with every item perfectly synchronized to his entrance. She never shared the bench with him. Instead, her role was to provide, consuming her own meal only after he finished. Her countenance remained entirely tranquil and seasoned, showing no traces of internal friction, which easily led me to assume initially that this display represented the ultimate form of long-term devotion. By the second day, I found myself in that unfamiliar workspace trying to locate the baking flour, peering into multiple cupboards to no avail. Stepping up to assist, she revealed a container hidden behind the sweetener container on an elevated ledge that required me to overextend my posture just to glimpse it. As she transferred the powder into my container, she shared a piece of advice that has remained with me for a decade and a half, noting that once the layout becomes second nature, the mind ceases to analyze it, and that this mental cessation marks the moment of true ownership. Her intention was purely consoling and hospitable, passing down the exact guidance she had inherited in her youth. Her assessment was entirely accurate regarding the process. One simply ceases to analyze the structural inconveniences, the mandatory pre-dawn culinary preparations, or the requirement to surrender physical autonomy regardless of emotional readiness. The surrounding culture labels this psychological numbness as tranquility, interpreting it as successful adaptation and satisfaction. However, with the perspective of 15 years separating me from that room, I recognize the process for what it truly is: a systematic configuration. She had been fully integrated into the machinery, and out of pure goodwill, she was now integrating me. This is the foundational blueprint. The initial romantic phase provides emotional attachment while withholding concrete operational realities. The formal ceremony executes a transfer of governance before hundreds of onlookers who legitimize it as a holy act. The newly assigned domestic space imprints the mandatory timeline for the rest of one's existence, while the absence of discourse regarding physical connection guarantees a total lack of bargaining power within the bridal chamber. Finally, the matriarchs who endured their own standard integration usher the newcomer into the apparatus with affection, basic necessities, and counsel that masquerades as devotion while operating as conditioning. Malice is entirely absent from the participants, a realization that requires significant time to fully grasp. The harshness resides not within the community members, but within the structural layout itself. The individuals are benevolent, yet the blueprint is unyielding, and the person ensnared within cannot distinguish between the two since compassion and control present an identical countenance. The apparatus targets emotion for enrollment, solidifies placement through ritual, and functions seamlessly through domestic timetables, marital quietude, and the enduring gentleness of older generations who have lost all recollection of an alternative existence. Consider the internal impact on an individual subjected to this environment. Within the opening week, the primary casualty is authentic rest. This does not imply forced sleep deprivation, but rather the total cessation of true physical surrender, the state where tension completely leaves the jaw, fingers uncurl, and respiration slows into a rhythm exclusively your own. That specific form of rest vanished instantly and remained absent for a prolonged period. Opening my eyes before daylight on that premiere morning, disorientation washed over me as the unfamiliar architecture, the strange scents, and an unprecedented physical presence beside me altered the environment. My anatomy reacted instinctively, mirroring livestock detecting an anomalous noise within an enclosure. Every fiber rigidified, inhalation turned superficial, and my senses heightened. I remained motionless, anticipating an indefinable shift, perhaps authorization, acknowledgement, or a sense of personal ownership over the chamber and the shadows. Nothing materialized except the rhythmic ticking filtering upward from the domestic area below, bringing a non-verbalized realization that seeped through the timber panels like winter air, reminding me of my duties downstairs. The hearth required ignition, and the morning beverage needed to be prepared, for the standard demonstrated to me previously left no room for a young wife to linger in repose seeking her own identity. By the dawn of the third day, physical soreness settled into my fingers, arising purely from repetitive strain rather than trauma. The labor demanded an entirely different physiological adaptation than what I had previously known. Though my childhood home required significant exertion, the tasks there were deeply familiar, the placement of implements predictable, and the mass of the cookware well understood. This new environment subverted my expectations at every turn, featuring jammed cutlery compartments and a heavy cooking vessel that far outweighed the one from my youth, its grip digging uncomfortably into my hand until a small, dark discoloration appeared in the shape of a crescent. I chose silence regarding this minor injury, as no receptive audience existed, and verbalizing my discomfort would equate to a confession of failure. In that household, hardship was an unacknowledged concept for a newly wedded woman. One was simply presumed to be adapting, integrating, and evolving. Open vulnerability was reserved exclusively for those resisting their designated path, and I exerted every ounce of physical capability to align myself with expectations. During the third night, immobilized by the shadows, I listened intently to the mechanical passing of time from the room below, tracking the count until it reached 412. That specific figure remains etched in my memory because the act of tracking belonged entirely to me, offering a solitary domain that required no sharing, no subjugation, and no premature surrender. Those 412 beats encapsulated the entire scope of my autonomy at that juncture. This illustrates the physical manipulation of the structure. It avoids overt harm or deprivation, choosing instead to reallocate the physical form, dictating its labor, its periods of rest, and its nocturnal existence without ever soliciting individual consent. The complete lack of overt mistreatment renders this colonization unnoticeable, leaving one unable to articulate an injury that leaves no visible mark, save for a minor discoloration on a hand caused by an unyielding cooking implement. Internal cognitive transformation lags behind physical adaptation. While the physical frame synchronizes with a new routine within 72 hours, the intellect demands logic and constantly seeks explanations. Within a framework structured entirely around compliance, asking for justification represents the ultimate internal threat. By the fourth day, a subtle alteration manifested within my consciousness, not a fully formed concept, but an emotional weight anchoring itself within my mind. Standing over the hearth, an unnameable restriction would tighten across my chest, prompting internal admonitions that I ought to experience joy, given that my circumstances aligned perfectly with every goal I had been conditioned to pursue. A sober partner, stable shelter, and a supportive collective that delivered provisions early on, while inquiring about my adjustment in a manner that permitted only a positive response. Concluding that I owed the universe appreciation, I transformed that internal restriction into a personal failing, viewing it as definitive proof of my own inadequacy, rather than questioning the environment, the rigid timeline, or the nocturnal quietude. On the fifth morning, while cleansing cookware at the basin without any recollection of its utilization, a phrase crystallized in my thoughts with pristine transparency. The realization articulated itself internally, utilizing my own internal voice and absolute conviction to remind me that this path was of my own choosing. I was the one who consented, donned the selected attire, occupied the pew, and pledged myself before hundreds of witnesses. Consequently, any current dissatisfaction could only be interpreted as a personal defect, as the reality matched my explicit requests perfectly. The cultural apparatus avoided confrontation or explicit lecturing entirely. It achieved its aims far more elegantly by conditioning my intellect to self-police. My internal monologue transformed into the primary mechanism of enforcement. My remorse functioned as the boundary wall, and I willingly tended to both structures each dawn amidst unremembered chores in a workspace I still struggled to navigate before sunrise. This represents the cognitive reconditioning of the structure, which opts to substitute your thoughts rather than erase them entirely. It takes the internal explorer that once pondered possibilities and personal desires, instructing it to constantly recite demands for appreciation, self-sufficiency, and the suppression of unfulfilled needs. Because this internal voice perfectly mimics your own cadence, detection becomes nearly impossible. The ultimate camouflage relies on the fact that the internal monitor possesses your exact features and regional dialect, rendering her completely unassailable since her post is located entirely within your own consciousness. Social dynamics dissolved with a swiftness that remains difficult to articulate without emotion even decades later. My childhood companions, with whom I had traversed the pastures near the academy and shared quiet observations during prolonged church services, the very individuals whose joy I could discern instantly amidst a crowd, were suddenly separated from me by an